And the afternoon, the evening sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers, stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head, grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker, and in short, I was afraid. Welcome to week 3. That was a stanza from T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Now, as you were reading the poetry this past week, I'm pretty sure some of you might have been a little bit perplexed at how to derive meaning from what seemed to be meaningless pieces of work. To this day, some critics still don't really have a handle on the meaning of that poem. But a lot of common understandings of that poem was that Eliot was dealing with themes of love, death, and reincarnation. Critics at the time of its publication in 1920 were mixed. Some said that it was a literary genius, while others disparaged it for its meaninglessness. One thing there is to be said that I think that we all can agree on about this poem is that it makes an array of references to these common themes that we see taking place. We have references to Dante's Inferno. We have references to Shakespeare's Hamlet. Like I said before, we have references that might suggest that this is a love story. We also have references that suggest that this is a man's birth, death, and reincarnation. The idea here is that meaning is fluid. And this is also one of the things that Eliot was getting at in tradition and individual talent, and a common theme that you'll also see in other writers of this time. So in this essay, he recognizes that the modern American poet was influenced by the European reading and literary tradition, and that the American poet still has to develop a consciousness of the past, but the past was fluid. So one of the things that you want to think about the writers of this time was that many of them were being criticized, particularly writers pre-1865, were being criticized that they were just mocking their European literary counterparts. So many critics would disparage American literary artists as saying that there was no real literary tradition in America, but rather just an extension of the European literary tradition. So after the Civil War, we have been reading about this search for American identity and realism and understanding the characteristics of people in a particular region. So authors are trying to understand what it means to be an American and how one's American identity is shaped. So when we think about this and we think about the writers of the 20th century, the writers of the 20th century realized their European influence, but they were trying to make a break from that European influence to create something completely American. One of the things that is so original to the American literary tradition that you're going to read for this week is the short story. So going back to this idea of what T.S. Eliot, or the multiplicity of meaning, if you will, in T.S. Eliot's poem, but also we'll notice this in the poetry, we'll notice this in the fiction of American writers, was that meaning, truth, is fluid. So we understand meaning by the context in which creates it. So for instance, when we think about the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, this particular poem is going to be interpreted and understood by that literary or that reading society of that time, which doesn't really give us an exclusive understanding of that poem, but rather gives us a better understanding of the community. So that means that we can understand this poem and literature and all forms of cultural expression based off of the society in which interprets it. So someone might have a different interpretation of that poem in 1920 than they would in 1960, than they would in 2013, based off of the society that influences them. One example that I like to discuss in my face-to-face classes that unfortunately we're not going to read this semester is J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. Now, this poem, when it was published in the early 1950s, was extremely controversial because the main character realizes that all of the important people, the people of status in his life, were nothing but phonies. Everything that he had learned about the ideology, the traditions of his culture was a sham. So when we think about the impact that this novel made on the reading culture of that time, and then we can compare that to how a classroom of students might respond to that novel in 2013, it gives us an example of some of the things that have taken place in history that might have influenced that reading society. So when we think about what's going on in the early 50s, we're coming off of America's involvement in World War II, which is coming off of America's involvement in World War I. And as a result of this, and going into also understanding the American identity, what it means to be American, there becomes more of a consistent ideology behind our involvement in war. We also see major economic boom. So we're making war parts, we're making the automobile, we are making advancements in technology. We are basically behind one sort of standard ideology of what it means to be an American, even though we have similarities and differences. So when we think about this idea of Catcher in the Rye and how Catcher in the Rye sort of had this influence, is that the main character goes through his experiences and realizes that this tradition, this idea, this culture is nothing but phony. So we can get an understanding of why this would be so controversial at that time and give us appreciation for the social historical sort of things or the things that went into sort of the conception of a story like this. But at the same time, we can also see how the culture has developed and sort of understanding this idea of cynicism and get an understanding of that based off of how readers might react to some of the major themes that are going on in Catcher in the Rye in 2013. So the same is true with the literature that you're reading this week. The same is true is with the poetry that you've read last week. Think about how cultural, social, historical context have an influence with how some of these major themes are developed and discussed. So this week you'll be reading short stories from a variety of authors. Some of those being Sherwood Anderson, Gertrude Stein, William Faulkner, and Zora Neale Hurston. You'll be paying attention, I want you to pay attention to common themes such as identity, concepts of truth, class, gender, race, and love. And as you're thinking about some of these themes, I also want you to pay close attention to the social historical context. And I also want you to pay attention to things such as region. So for instance, you're reading authors that have an understanding of what it means to be an American and how they conceptualize their quote unquote American characters. And you have settings in the South, you have settings in the Midwest, you have settings on the East Coast. So think about how these settings also influence some of the decisions that these characters make. So one of the things that as you continue to read, and I also want to just, again, pay particular attention to how after the Civil War, we sort of have this sort of concept or this sort of standard concept, which sort of has its own power of what it means to be an American. And also, I want you to think about how marginalized cultures have sort of had to construct a concept based off of this ideology. So, for instance, how do Native Americans sort of conceptualize what it means to be an American? How do African Americans? How do Latino Americans? How do people that have immigrated over from Europe sort of create a concept of, or still have a sense of their cultural identity and assimilate into American culture. So when we think about this and we think about this idea of what it means to be American, I want you to think about of all of the an array of viewpoints that go into this sort of this melting pot of understanding American identity. Now, with the literature that you're reading this week, let me pull up the course activities because I want to be sure that I don't forget anything. So, as always, this week you'll start off with a social historical context of the literature that you'll be reading in the book. And then, like I said before, you'll be reading short stories from Stein, Anderson, Hurston, and Faulkner. Now, this week, I want you to continue to work on major paper number 2, which is the new critical essay. As a reminder, you can begin to submit your essay to the Dropbox as early as July 22nd, no later than July 26th. Now, keep in mind that if you submit your paper on the 24th or late in the evening on the 24th or on the 25th, that just lessens the opportunity and the chance that I can provide feedback for you. So I would say to submit your paper the earlier, the better. It does not matter if your conclusion isn't completely written out or you're still working out areas in the body. Send me what you have as early as possible so that I can give you feedback and you can continue to compose your paper. For this week's discussion board post, it'll be completely optional. So here I would like you to take advantage of this week's discussion board to pose questions that you're having about the readings. I also want you to pose questions about the composition of your current paper. You can also use the discussion board this week to share any learning materials that you found to better help you understand the reading material or understand the composition of your paper. So for instance, you might find some information as you're reading Barn Burning, for instance, from William Faulkner, and you really don't understand what might be going on in that story, and then you do some background reading and you find this really good website that sort of decodes class in William Faulkner's short story, and you want to post that to the discussion board, by all means do that. Over the course of this week, I'm going to be going through that week's discussion board, and I'm going to be posting up some things too that I have come across in past classes that I've used that I think that might be helpful to you. As a reminder, go back, look at the past discussion board posts. I'm still going through, and I've looked at all of those from week 1 and week 2, but I always like to go back through to double check to make sure that I haven't forgotten anything. So there's still possibilities that I might comment in some of the previous discussion board posts. So, as always, everything you need to know is in the content section. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please shoot me an email and let me know. Once again, keep those things in mind. Keep the idea of how one's culture might influence how they have an understanding of their identity and how they might understand their culture. Post to the discussion board this week. And if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. And happy reading.